performed by Russian surgeons in the 1930s. Animal experimentation in which the ability to suture on new limbs and to suture in kidneys, which was a favorite organ for attempted transplantation, slowly began. But the really extraordinary step forward took place in the 1940s, during the Second World War, when the British surgeon, Sir Peter Medawar, worked to replace skin tissue in soldiers, and particularly airmen, who had suffered very serious burns. And in doing that, he began to see for the first time that if the tissue came from a close relative, it seemed to take. And the connection between genetics and transplantation was first developed and discovered by Medawar. In 1954 was the first really extraordinary successful transplant, the transplantation of a human kidney from one young man to another young man, and the secret was that they were identical twins, and there was no rejection. So the Boston surgeons, Murray and Merrill, succeeded in first successful transplantation in which the recipient of the transplant lived for many, many years after that event. And then those two surgeons continued on, working always with identical twins and attempting to discover what it was about genetics, about the genetic relationship that enabled the transplantation to succeed. In the 1960s, Dr. Paul Terasaki at UCLA was the first to successfully tissue type. That is, to apply the same sort of typing of tissue that was discovered in the early part of the century with regard to blood types, the A, B, and O groups of blood types that allowed transfusion, which is, of course, also a form of transplantation, that allowed transfusion to take place, to tissue generally. And therefore, it soon became possible to go beyond the identical twins to other relatives, because one could look at the tissue and be able to see through the tissue typing techniques whether that tissue was more likely to succeed in a transplant than to be rejected. Then in 1967, the second great success with regard to organ transplantation, heart transplantation, where Dr. Christian Barnard in South Africa succeeded in a successful transplant, somewhat successful. The patient lived only a few months, but still lived and did not go through the terrible graft versus host disease and rejection that usually took place. He tried again, tried several times more. Again, patients living for several months, but then dying. There was very quickly an effort to carry on transplantation throughout the world, not with great success, with the same sorts of limitations. And soon there was a moratorium called on transplantation by tissue transplanters everywhere, in order to study more carefully the process that was taking place. I remember personally in 1967, when I was in Europe, being at the train station in Heidelberg, and I was waiting for the train. When I arrived at the station, there was a very large crowd, all standing, and the platform was blocked off. And the train arrived and stopped, and one person stepped off onto the platform. And there was a choir from the university. In Heidelberg, the university choirs, all the choruses all look like student princes, that all wearing a little Heidelberg hat. And they started to sing right away when this man stepped off the platform Ich habe mein Herz in Heidelberg verloren. I left my heart in Heidelberg. That's their version of I left my heart in San Francisco. But I left my heart in Heidelberg, and of course it was Christian Barnard who had just come to do a great tour of Europe after his first heart transplants in South Africa. During the 1960s, great success was achieved in the development of immunosuppressive drugs. The development of azathioprine or Imuran, the development and the use of corticosteroids to prevent rejection took place during the 1960s and 70s. And so it was possible even to extend further and further beyond the immediate relatives. Tissue typing and immunosuppressive drugs and improved surgical techniques finally made transplantation a common and accepted practice, so that during the 1980s, it was not only kidneys, hearts, but livers and lungs, pancreases, and gut that could all be transplanted, and all of those, of course, were life-saving. And the success, both in saving people from immediate death and in helping them to live a longer life, had been achieved. Well, how does that history, through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, fit with Catholic moral theology? There was a problem. Transplantation, particularly if it took an organ from a living human being, as was very frequently the case with kidney transplant. It was not the case with heart transplant, because if you take hearts from living human beings, you make them dead human beings. But with kidney transplant, there is a living organ taken, and soon later on, it also became possible to do partial liver transplants as well. So for Catholic moral theology, the only conception that was available to use to think about the morality of that procedure was the treatise of Catholic moral theology on mutilation. Now, as you know, the mutilation of human bodies is abhorrent in many cultures, even to the extent of repudiating the possibility of dissection of human body, of the human dead body, considered to be a mutilation. And in Catholic moral theology, there had been a discussion of mutilation as a moral issue since at least the 17th century, 16th century. The Jesuit theologian, Cardinal de Lugo, discusses mutilation and asks the question, is it appropriate to mutilate any part of the human body? Mutilation being defined as the removal of any bodily organ or part that represses its natural function. Cardinal de Lugo says that this is contrary to the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. It is a subset of killing, removal of an organ or an organic function. And he uses the principle that the human body is under the dominion of God, and God alone can dispose of its parts. And the human who has the body has it, as it were, on loan, and must be a steward of its good condition. There is one exception, and that one exception is if a part of the body is in some way diseased so that it might cause serious death or disability of the person.